Right, we should be live streaming core with the right title this time. That's a problem.
Okay, it has the right title. And I see everything going, and I pushed stop so that it doesn't keep playing in the background of my. So we should be good to go.
Okay. Let's just give it a couple minutes. All right, I think we can get started now. So, hello everyone. My name is Amanda Pfeiffer. I'm an education coordinator at the Canadian Light Source. Before we get into the seminar, I just have a couple housekeeping things to take care of. So we are live streaming through YouTube with the correct seminar title this time. So if you want to keep your video off, you're more than welcome to. The students actually are going to be sharing a video kind of halfway through their presentation as well. So that might help with their bandwidth if you keep your videos off. For those of you joining in through WebEx, you do have the option to change your layout. If you click in the top right-hand corner, you should have a layout icon, and you can change it so it is side-by-side view. Each of the students are connecting in from their homes, and so they'll be switching who is talking, but that might just give you a different layout option. And there will be a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to post your questions in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask the students directly. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and get you students to bring up your presentation as I introduce you. So we have 7 high school students from North Park Secondary School that is located in Brampton, Ontario. And excuse me, they used the Ideas Beamline this past weekend actually to look at different water samples from the Greater Toronto area. They're going to tell you what they found. So with that, take it away.
Before we begin our presentation, we would like to acknowledge the land we are meeting on and sampled from is the traditional territory of many First Nations groups, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Erie people, the Neutral Nation, and the Huron-Wendat people.
We also acknowledge that the c.l.s. in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan is located on Treaty 6 land in the traditional territories of the Nahiawak, Anishinaabeg, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. Something to note here is that not all First Nations flags were presented on the screen.
Never know the worth of water until the well is dry.
If there's magic on this planet, it is contained in water.
Water is life's matter and matrix, mother and medium. There is no life without water.
These quotes and the continuing climate crisis impacted all of us and inspired us to do research on something happening in our very own backyard.
Instead of taking a top-down approach, we chose to swim a little deeper.
Something really close to home, a place called Lake Ontario.
Hi, I'm one of the students who is a part of this presentation. My name is Lavin Surendra. I got into this research because I was very interested in how machines like these would work. And I'm in grade 11, and I go to North Park Secondary School.
Hi, my name is Gloria Samra, and I'm the other grade 11 who goes to North Park Secondary School along with my classmates. I wanted to take part in this because I was interested in the consequences of water pollution.
Hi, my name is Rahani Walia. I'm a 12th grade student at North Park Secondary School, I'm really interested in human behavior, so it was really, really interesting to see how something as essential as water impacts us so much.
Hi, my name is Jasner, and I'm also a grade 12 student at North Park Secondary School. And this project really interested me because I have a deep interest in science.
Hey, wrapping up the grade 11s, I'm Aryan. I'm another one of the students on SSTV today. And I chose to pursue this project because of my keen interest in research in general, and because particle accelerators are kind of cool.
Hi everyone, I'm Tejver Multani. I'm in grade 12. And the reason why I decided to jump in on this project is I'm a biotech researcher. I love anything biotech, and I think this is a perfect fit and a perfect connection to how the environment has a huge impact on our day-to-day lives, and how can science really change the way we live our lives as a whole.
Hi, my name is Jamal Dawadi, and I'm also a grade 12 student at North Park Secondary School. And the reason why I chose to take part in this research project is because I was really interested in looking at the technology behind the synchrotron, and also looking at how water, something that we use on a daily basis that's essential, and how it impacts us. So as Amanda mentioned, we are high school students from North Park Secondary School in Brampton, Ontario. Today, we welcome you to our seminar in which we are going to try to answer the question, what's really in our water?
Before we begin, here's a quick overview of what you can expect through this seminar. We'll be talking about the scientific process, data analysis, doing some elemental analysis, and finally wrapping it all up with some summary and reflection.
Recently, the province of Ontario has significantly improved how it alerts its citizens of safety and security issues. Case in point, the province began issuing Amber Alerts on our cell phones. It seems like a great step forward for collective awareness, so it was interesting for us to read about the Ashbridge treatment plan and the city's water quality notification system often being ineffective. The government has attempted to be more transparent to the general public with reliable information through programs such as Preserving and Protecting Our Environment for Generations, a Made in Ontario Environment Plan, which monitors and reports public sewage overflows. According to residents of Ontario, including Matt Matson, the co-founder of Lake Ontario Waterkeeper and the president of Swim Drink Fish, there are a lot of disappointments in the plan, but there's also a really hopeful sign that the government wants to increase transparency through real-time monitoring of sewage overflows from municipal wastewater systems. This is a drastic improvement in communication from the government compared to the 2013 Toronto flooding.
In July of 2013, massive amounts of rain fell on Toronto, overwhelmed city infrastructure, and knocked out power to at least one wastewater treatment plant. This caused the city to release more than 1 billion liters of raw sewage into Lake Ontario in a single day. Despite the fact that contact with contaminated water can result in illness and infection, the public doesn't often receive notice when sewage has entered the waterways in which people swim, boat, and fish.
Luckily, in 2013, Toronto was well equipped. The water treatment plant in Toronto was well equipped to handle the flooding in general. The treatment plant used a diversion technique called bypassing to direct some of the floodwater directly back into the Lake Ontario. Water treatment plants actually use a bypass in scenarios where too much water has entered the treatment plant and the plant is not able to meet the demand. Thus, through bypassing, the water will receive some preliminary screening, such as grit, which is sand and stone removal, primary treatment, which is the removal of material through physical processes, and full disinfection before it becomes effluent by being released into the lake. Luckily, a bypass system was in place in 2013 for Toronto.
So after seeing such a story, it's important to note the urban water cycle that brings water to our homes. Lake Ontario is the biggest body of freshwater close to our hometowns and our primary source for drinking water. The water from the lake passes through an intense filtration process at each municipality, which then passes through city water mains and finally reaches our taps through residential service pipes. This water is then used and then drained away, along with sewage, waste, and more things. The sewage system takes this to the wastewater treatment plants, which treat the water again before dumping it out into the lake. We will be looking deeper into these processes for our research study.
Over the past 16 months, our team has looked into what elements reside in our water. We researched the question, what is the effectiveness of treating wastewater in the Hamilton, Peel, and Toronto wastewater treatment plants along Lake Ontario relative to Ontario drinking water quality standards?
To begin our research, we looked at industry surrounding the lake in each of the regions we planned to study. We formed hypotheses and conducted a literature review on the following elements which we believed were most likely to be found in the water. These elements include arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, copper, mercury, calcium, phosphorus, and iron. Some of the literature we used to reinforce our idea as to why such elements could be found in Lake Ontario include the Ontario Drinking Standard, information from the Canadian government's website, or scientific articles/books they published, like The Toxic Chemicals in the Great Lakes and Associated Effects, Volume 1, Contaminant Levels and Trends, as well as other scientific articles by various individual researchers and news articles by the Global News, CBC, and many more.
Findings from our literature review led us to form our original hypothesis. There will be a concentration of transition metals that exceed the Ontario Drinking Water Quality Standard, including phosphorus, calcium, iron, and/or arsenic. The most significant key takeaways from our literature review suggested which elements are most likely to be found in water due to human causes of the initial list of hypothesized elements. It also clarified which would likely be found in a more natural way. For example, calcium is a common mineral found in freshwater, which Lake Ontario is. The key takeaways from our case study analysis indicated that the four elements, phosphorus, calcium, iron, and arsenic, were not only likely to be found in water, but also had some of the most harmful health side effects. For example, arsenic is considered a carcinogen by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and a case study published by Environmental Health Perspective found that more than 350,000 people in the United States may be supplied drinking water containing over 50 milligrams per liter of arsenic, and more than 2.5 million people may have water with levels above 25 milligrams per liter. For context, the safe standard is 10 milligrams per liter.
To kick off our research, we took water samples from 3 locations around Lake Ontario. From our research, we discovered that water in different regions undergo different wastewater treatment processes. Based on this, we decided to sample water from the following regions: Hamilton, Peel, and Toronto.
Now I'll be explaining how our sampling apparatus actually works. Firstly, it's made up of the following materials: a broomstick, some screws, some string, a bath plug, a funnel, some adhesive materials, a zip tie, a hose clamp, as well as a mason jar, which would be attached here at the bottom, which was able to be screwed up. How it worked was that we walked into the lake at about 15 meters and 17 meters, and we submerged the broomstick about 2 feet deep into the lake. We were able to measure this using the indications here alongside the broomstick. Once we are at our desired distance and our desired depth, we simply pulled the bath plug at our indicated time. This allowed the water to enter our mason jars down here at the bottom. Once we had collected enough water, we simply brought up the apparatus as such, dislodged the mason jar from below here, and brought our samples back to shore and repeated the process. Now I'll be explaining how our sampling.
To collect our samples, our team split up and traveled to Hamilton, Peel, and Toronto. To ensure consistency, we created controls for our sample collection procedure. In each city, we collected 6 samples.
The first sample was collected from the lake at a depth of 2 feet and 15 meters from the shore. The second was collected from a tap water source in the same city. And the third was collected from the same lake at a depth of 2 feet and 17 meters from the shore.
We chose these distances of 15 and 17 meters to determine if there would be a difference in the data spatially. We controlled the depth to 2 meters, which provided suitable conditions to collect the sample, because the student body was alerted to not obtain water from large depths due to safety reasons, of course, as not everyone was tall enough to venture further out into the water.
6 samples from each city were collected at 2 different intervals. The first 3 at 12:30 p.m. and the next 3 at 3:30 p.m. The same rationale we provided before for why we chose the specific distances and depth applies to the difference of timing. We wanted to determine any differences that may arise in our data, if any at all, due to temporal change. The morning and afternoon differed in weather conditions, which added another layer of differentiation for our samples. The same day that the samples were collected, pictures of which you can see here, they were placed in a container. Later, the samples were stored away from direct sunlight and in a room temperature environment. The samples were stored in this method from August to October of 2020 before being shipped to the c.l.s. in October, where they were stored in the same manner until March 2021.
Before our water samples could be tested using the synchrotron, Amanda and David, who are here today, prepared them for us. They shook the mason jars for about 10 seconds and then inserted a pipette in the middle of the jar, taking a consistent amount of water each time. Amanda added 5 drops to each sample holder, which she then sealed. There were a few samples that potentially had air bubbles, but this obstacle can easily be overcome as ideas can select a different area of the sample. Some of her observations regarding the samples was that there was visible material floating at the top, perhaps sand and dirt. 4 to 6 batches of the samples also had a distinct odor when she opened them. The synchrotron was perfect for conducting our research as it would allow us to accurately find what elements were in the water of Ontario. The synchrotron is a machine that produces a beam of brilliant light, sometimes called a beam of synchrotron light. It produces beams of various wavelengths. This is very important because different materials absorb energy at unique levels. This machine is not the only method of producing these forms of light, but it is much faster and brighter. The synchrotron accelerates electron speed to allow imaging, diffraction, and spectroscopy. This machine can be used to perform a number of tests, such as Xrf or Zanes, which is what we used it for with the IDEAS Beamline.
So after the samples were prepared by Amanda and David, we ran these samples with David's help during our beam time. We used the Xrf Imaging Technique to analyze our water samples. So what is Xrf? Xrf stands for X-ray fluorescence, and it uses Ketek detectors. Basically, X-ray light will be passed through the samples and cause electrons within the atoms in the sample to be excited. These electrons are then emitted by the atom as the X-ray light hits them. This leaves holes in the atom's orbitals, and other electrons will begin to fill these holes, and as they fill up, the electrons will emit photons and energy, which is picked up by the Ketek scanner. The amount of photons picked up depends on how much of the element is relatively present, and the amount of energy picked up depends on what specific element is present. Since these energy levels are specific to each element, we measured the amount of light released to determine what elements were inside our water samples. So the detectors outputted data, which we were able to graph and analyze. We can take a quick look here at what these graphs may show. Here we can see the energy levels across the x-axis and use that to determine which elements are present in our sample based on the different peaks. For example, according to some data sheets from the c.l.s, we know that iron occurs when there is a peak at 6,400 eV. By examining the height of the peaks, we can also determine the relative presence of that element. We can also use this graph to extract some qualitative data later on. Now we'll be looking at the data we retrieved from our beam time and trying to make some sense of it. After we tested these samples, we realized that our initial hypothesis was no longer as relevant as we once thought it would be. Our data was telling a different story, so we adjusted our hypothesis accordingly. This is because we did not find our hypothesized elements, and we could not compare the quantitative data to Ontario drinking quality standards. This was a limitation in the beam time, and it also could indicate that the water treatment plants were effective in treating those certain heavy metals.
So our research and the rest of the seminar has been changed to instead focus on answering the question, what is the effectiveness of treating water in the Hamilton, Peel, and Toronto water treatment plants along Lake Ontario relative to each other?
Therefore, our new hypothesis became, we believe that there will be a difference in the effectiveness of water treatment between Hamilton, Peel, and Toronto. We plan to evaluate effectiveness by comparing the concentration of elements found in the samples. Next, we will look at the 3 main points to help us answer our new hypothesis and question, the first of which is lake versus tap water.
To begin with, we decided to take a look at the intensity ratio of a particular element in both lakes and taps relative to each other for each respective city. The intensity of a specific element in Xrf gives us a sense of confidence. A higher intensity would suggest that we have a higher probability of finding that specific element in a given sample. This also gives us the confidence to assume that the metal with a greater ratio will also be present in all the other parts of the lake, not just in our sample. The graph represents the Xrf data for both morning lake and morning tap water for the region of Peel. In order to obtain the ratios we presented in the graph, the largest intensity peaks were picked for each respective element in both the lake and tap water, and a lake-to-tap ratio was calculated. So for iron, the element found at the intensities in Peel, we would look at the peak near 6,400 electron volts and EV. And the intensity value at those respective lake and tap peaks would be divided to give us a ratio that is shown in the table beside. The given data mostly follows the anticipated pattern. The intensity of any given element would be higher at the lake than in the water, though there were some anomalies in the data set. Looking at the Hamilton data, we see the ratio for zinc is 0.79 to 1 in favor for the tap water. Something to keep in mind here would be that the intensity levels on the Xrf scans do not highlight the concentration of each particular element for its given samples. Hence, we merely compare the intensity of particular elements in terms of lake and tap samples for each respective cities, respective cities and particular element in order to give us a relative and qualitative comparison. Intensity for our purposes numerically defines the number of released photons that are captured by the K-Tech detectors earlier mentioned by Jamil. Finding individual concentrations will not only be inaccurate, but also require exhaustive mathematics. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at the anomaly. The electron voltage for a large peak for zinc is around 8,620 electron volts. We have scaled the graph for that given range in order to allow us a better look at the comparison between HL15 in blue, the Hamilton lake water, and HT1 in red, the Hamilton tap water. We see a clear distinction in the intensities of two samples, where the tap water shows a larger intensity for the given electron volts. This allows us to get a little more confident about the finding in zinc, that in tap water is higher relative to the lake water. This anomaly will be further dissected in the presentation.
All right, so here's a graph of all the tap water samples in the morning time. We would like to point out that in one of the previous graphs, there was a very large peak on the left side, which was argon, a noble gas, and likely from an air bubble in the sample. Some other element peaks we found earlier were calcium, titanium, and a few others. But we decided to zone in and zoom in on these few elements, iron, copper, and zinc. This is because one key piece of information we noted was that each city had a distinct peak that was higher relative to the other two for a specific element. To start on this graph, the Peel region tap samples had a higher peak for iron compared to Toronto and Hamilton tap samples, as indicated by the red line on this graph. Next, we noticed that Toronto had a higher peak for copper compared to Hamilton and Peel region samples, as indicated by the green line here. Finally, it was somewhat clear that the Hamilton tap samples had a higher presence of zinc compared to the other two regions, as seen here and indicated by the blue line. This was very interesting because each city had its own distinct element, and this was something we knew that we had to analyze.
Now that we have given an overview of our findings and the three elements of interest, we are going to dive deeper into an element analysis. In this section, we will discuss our hypotheses for why each of these elements was found, why they were in higher concentration in certain regions than in others, and what this means for the average person.
One of the most prevalent elements we identified on our Xrf data was iron. This element was identified in the lake water for all three regions. The presence of iron can be attributed to various different causes throughout the city, ranging from niche-specific industry to the treatment process itself. Iron is used as a flocculation agent in wastewater treatment to help aid the removal of phosphorus, specifically ferrous chloride, which could help explain the presence of iron in all these samples because all three regions used ferrous chloride. Moreover, wastewater bypass and effluent drainage systems in all these different locations use a similar material for drainage pipes, that being ductile iron. Industries such as steel manufacturing industries in Hamilton can also influence the amount of iron present in the water. The steel plant in Hamilton in particular has its own wastewater treatment plant that processes the slag from iron ore processing, which often consists of iron oxide and calcium oxide, as a flocculant to treat its phosphoric waste, which is then directly dumped into the lake. This may also lead to an extended presence of iron in that lake sample.
Iron is likely present in most of the tap water samples due to these major factors. First of all, most of the cities use ductile iron or cast iron piping systems for their water mains, which we mentioned way earlier. Zinc anodes are added to protect the iron in this piping from corroding. However, if these pipes aren't maintained regularly, these zinc anodes may deteriorate over time, leading to the iron rusting away as opposed to the zinc as the water passes through. So longer gaps between maintenance times in the Peel region may cause the higher iron presence in Peel relative to the other two cities. Second, the sampling distance may also play a role in the levels of iron present in the tap water samples. If the samples were taken at a further distance away from the city's filtration plant relative to the other cities, then there may be the water might be passing through the piping for a longer time and corroding more iron away. Finally, according to the Canadian government, iron is generally found in low amounts in drinking water due to the natural processes such as microorganisms and more.
Now let's jump into the fun stuff. Why should you care? Well, I'll be addressing the implications of iron in water in 3 categories: health, environment, and economics. So, what are the biological implications of iron in water? First of all, iron is not hazardous. In fact, it is classified as a secondary contaminant according to the United States Environmental and Protection Agency. Our body uses iron for biological purposes, such as transporting oxygen in our blood. This is the exact reason why the Ontario government has a high drinking quality standard for iron at 0.3 parts per million. Considered and compared to other heavy metals, iron has a high standard cutoff. Be that as it may, ingestion of large quantities of iron from water may result in secondary hemochromatosis, a condition in which normal digestive mechanisms do not operate effectively. This occurs when your intestines cannot absorb all of the iron in your food. Since iron is stored in different organs in your body, including the heart, pancreas, and liver, excessive iron consumption can damage these internal organs. But it is important to note that these are rare complications, but they are not impossible. Secondly, plumbing is a huge issue when it comes to iron bacteria. Certain bacteria, including those from the genus Gallionella, Leptothrix, and Geobacter, as you can see on the top right image, are iron oxidizing bacteria that thrive in habitats with reduced iron. And as Jamal and Aryan have mentioned, these iron piping, the ductile iron pipes, are the perfect home for such bacteria. They thrive in this type of environment. The redox reaction, in which these type of bacterium gain electrons or energy, which results in the production of a brownish and yellow slime in the piping of your home, which is a type of biofilm that can clog plumbing and leave a strong odor. Although iron bacteria on its own is not dangerous, it adds organic matter to water, which means that it can give rise to disease-causing or pathogenic organisms like cyanobacteria. And in terms of money, in terms of economics, this is also why many individuals opt for water softeners, as you can see on the top left, which is an example of a type of water softener which is sold by private companies like Culligan Water that can go up for $22 a month, that can filter out low levels of iron using salts. Finally, high concentrations of iron in the environment can influence algae growth and composition in freshwater lakes, like Lake Ontario. According to a study published by the Fresenius Environmental Bulletin, when iron concentrations range from 0.1 to 1 milligrams per liter or parts per million, green algae shift to cyanobacteria, which can affect other organisms and the environment. Cyanobacteria can steal the oxygen that is required by other organisms for metabolic processes such as cellular respiration. They also make cyanotoxins, which are known to be one of the most powerful poisons in the world.
Another key element that we researched was copper. One of the reasons we may have seen copper in Ontario's lake water could be because of an asphalt contractor right by the shoreline in Hamilton, which treats its own water instead of going through the city's system. Through research, we found that copper slag, which is pictured there, which is composed of heavy metals, is commonly used to help shape asphalt. So this may be a reason for why copper is in the Hamilton lake samples.
According to several articles by the Government of Canada and the City of Toronto itself, most water mains are made of iron or ductile iron pipes, which we've mentioned. However, when these water mains are not made of ductile iron, copper tracer wire and metallic copper service connections are typically used. Depending on the environment, certain places require metallic copper piping as opposed to ductile iron or polyethylene pipes. And for example, that might look like residential plumbing. According to the Canadian government, copper is also generally found in drinking water for its use in plumbing and water services, which may be a point of validation for this hypothesis. Additionally, the City of Toronto reported experiencing an average of 1,400 water main breaks annually. We found this really interesting. Upon further research, we found that the city started a water main structural lining initiative in January of 2015. So they used cleaning and cured in-place pipes, an acronym for that is CIPP, to line the inside of water mains to prevent breaks from happening. The liner is soaked in a combination of resin and epoxy. Further research on this found that resin and epoxy can contain copper. So in one specific version of the polymer, copper particles were used to stabilize the formula and create a conductive epoxy. Conductive epoxies, again, more research, are used in cases where the risk of mechanical cracking, such as the pressure of water in pipes, is high. While we can't say for certain, of course, that the CIPP used a copper-based resin, our research suggests that this is a possibility for why Toronto had more copper relative to the other regions.
Oh, here's what's up with copper. A research study done on the effects of graded copper on the gastrointestinal tract suggested that certain levels of copper, especially above 3 milligrams per liter, a higher incidence of diarrhea, abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting, whereas concentrations up to 2 milligrams per liter showed similar results, but in rarity. A UC Berkeley researcher, Dr. Chris Chang, annotated the effects of copper on neurons in one of his research papers. He noticed that copper acts as a dimmer switch or a brake for the neuron and slowing down the signal processing. The neurological impacts of high copper intake are also backed up by other research papers that suggest that copper-induced DNA damage should increase in neuronal death, neurotoxicity, and Alzheimer's. In Ontario, the maximum legal concentration of copper is 2 milligrams per liter, with the aesthetic limit being 1 milligrams per liter. Some aesthetic implications of excessive copper would comprise of water discoloration and metallic and bitter taste. On the flip side of things, copper is an essential nutrient for humans. Copper plays an important role in the human enzymatic reaction and metabolism by allowing iron absorption. Copper deficiency has been linked with anemia, which is iron deficiency, neutropenia, low number of neutrophils, which are a type of white blood cells, and cardiovascular disturbances such as tachycardia, which is increased and sustained heartbeat, and in some cases, myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack. Overall, copper is essential for the maintenance of blood vessels, immune systems, and nerves. In terms of the environment, copper is defined to have acute toxicity to aquatic life, especially fish. A paper published by the Faculty of Mining at University of British Columbia suggested that copper exposure showed signs of mental deterioration among salmon, which is a fish species found largely in Lake Ontario.
Moving on to our next element, the presence of zinc in the lake water samples was insignificant in comparison to the tap samples. From a health perspective, we found that zinc is an essential element and is generally considered non-toxic to humans. So swimming in a lake, for example, with low concentrations is not harmful. To explain why we found zinc anodes have been used as a coating on metallic parts of boats for several years to prevent corrosion, which may explain small amounts of zinc in lakes. The reason zinc is used as a coating is because it has higher oxidation potential in the water and ensures that the zinc anode would corrode as opposed to the propeller and other metallic parts of the boat. However, upon further research, we discovered that most of the zinc found in lakes will not dissolve or even float, but instead it'll settle at the bottom. Given that our sampling depth was only 2 feet, this may explain why we found lower levels in comparison to the tap water and low levels generally. Another piece of evidence that may suggest why we found lower levels is that when high levels of zinc are found in soil, water, and air, it is usually found alongside high levels of other metals like lead and cadmium, neither of which we discovered. The reason they are often found together is because of industrial waste produced by metal manufacture.
The presence of zinc in tap samples could be from the structure and elements used to build these pipes. In fact, zinc cathodes are used for galvanic prevention in these pipes to prevent corrosion and for grounding. Hamilton had the highest amount of zinc in tap water relative to the 2 other regions, and this is likely because of recent piping changes or maintenance that was done. New zinc anodes are added for protection against iron corrosion in the water mains, which could explain why the city has higher concentrations of zinc compared to the others, but also less iron. Further research indicated that several water mains have been recently replaced since most were made over 50 years ago and required maintenance due to public health concerns in Hamilton, especially with lead piping that was used in the past. According to the Canadian government, zinc is also generally found in drinking water for its wide use in plumbing and water services.
Now let's jump back into the implications. So zinc is an element that is essential for humans because it contains proteins and enzymes that help metabolism and the replication and translation of genetic material. To reflect its essential nature, the Ontario government does not have a set drinking water quality standard for zinc due to how rare zinc toxicity is. This is because our body has homeostatic control mechanisms that prevent overabsorption of zinc in the body. In fact, about 80 to 90% of zinc is found in erythrocytes, which are red blood cells. However, the Canadian government website claims that the immune response in humans is reported to be impaired by excessive zinc intake. So although it is unlikely to face adverse implications and complications similar to iron, it is not impossible. Although it is not hazardous to us, it is to those who share a lovely home with us in this beautiful planet, aquatic life. According to a study conducted by the Australian government, zinc harmed 33 saltwater animals off the coast of Australia. Since zinc has no definite water standard issued by the Ontario government, this can lead to effects that we may not comprehend. In fact, the Canadian government states that the aesthetic objective for zinc in drinking water is therefore less than 5 milligrams per liter or parts per million. However, with this amount, aquatic life such as mysid shrimp can face acute toxicity. These mysids or opossum shrimps can face acute toxicity at 120 micrograms per liter or parts per billion, which compared to the 5 parts per million is 42 times less. This means that the 5 parts per million, which is considered the aesthetic objective, is 42 times more acutely toxic than the accepted amount. That is unbelievable. This is a relatively small amount, and since the Ontario government has no set amount for regulatory purposes, this can be dangerous for aquatic life. A point to note that this environmental correlation is international, but its findings are relevant to aquatic life found in Lake Ontario. The invasive species of bloody red shrimp, which are related to mysid, are present in Lake Ontario. Since they are invasive, the Ontario government may or may not address zinc toxicity on these animals. And some of the consequences of excessive zinc intake, if I add, would rather cause nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, stomach cramps, diarrhea, and headaches, just to name a few. And a prolonged time with an excess of zinc can cause problems such as low copper levels in the body, preventing poor iron absorption, lower immunity, and low levels of HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol.
As we near the end of our seminar, we would like to reiterate the elements we discussed and consider what we could have improved over the course of our research.
Summarize. Our seminar focused on 3 main ideas. The first is that we realized after our beam time that our data was actually telling a very different story than what we had initially predicted it would. So we adjusted our hypothesis and research question. Instead of looking at wastewater, we found it more interesting and relevant to look at the differences between our lake and tap samples, which is our second big idea. Further research here allowed us to discover our 3 main elements of interest. This leads me to our final big idea, which was conducting an element analysis on these 3. We spent a lot of time discussing our hypotheses and causation suggested by our data for why we might have found higher levels of iron, zinc, and copper in Peel, Hamilton, and Toronto, respectively. In the process, we learned a lot about water treatment processes used in the province where we live, the waste produced by large industries like steel manufacturing plants and asphalt contracting, and recent initiatives in some of the ways, including zinc anodes and cleaning and cured in-place pipes, which are so cool that our cities are working to improve water main sustainability.
As researchers, a very crucial aspect of our journey is reflecting and considering what we would have changed or done differently. Thinking back, we wish that we had gotten the chance to receive our desired lake control, which is water from the middle of the lake. This could have given us an even better understanding of the chemical bearing compared to the water we collected close to the surface, which would be impacted to an extent by the runoff. In our literature review, we also came across a lot of information regarding the impact of water contamination on soil quality by Lake Ontario. This is very interesting information, and we would have liked to research it more, perhaps by testing coastal samples of soil. Lastly, we wish that we had had time to test all of our samples for speciation using Zanes instead of just the ones with anomalies.
We'd like to thank the entire team at c.l.s, including David, Amanda, Brian, Anna Maria, and Tracy, for explaining the synchrotron to us, being patient, and for doing all that you could to make this experience as close to what it would have been like in person in Saskatchewan. We would also like to thank the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council for making this possible.
We would like to thank our teachers, Mr. Rabaya and Ms. Kiba, for giving us this amazing opportunity and all those extra hours that you guys put in. You always pushed us to excel, and without you, we wouldn't be here without your guidance and support.
Finally, thank you all so much for attending our seminar. It's been a long time in the making, and we have all so much gratitude in this experience.
This project has definitely challenged us academically, creatively, so we are super fond to hear that our samples similarly challenge the Beamline.
Thank you for listening. If there are any questions, we're happy to take them now. Thank you for the virtual claps.
This is where we need to have a soundtrack that comes up and does bit loud cheering and everything at the end of a seminar.
Do we raise our hands for questions or do we just go?
Why don't you start by stopping to share your screen so that we can see each other? Wonderful, thank you.
I hope you guys can see me. So my question was, can you guys elaborate on the economic impact of iron? You guys had that here.
Yeah, so I could just jump in for the implication. So the economic implication that we focused on for this study was not emphasizing government control, government maintenance, labor costs that the government has to issue themselves. It's more targeted towards you guys, audience, the citizens, and how that cost has to affect or is relating to you. So that's why we've talked about water softeners. But the economic implications can connect to the actual iron bacteria plumbing costs, which can go up to $200,000 to $20,000 depending on the severity of the plumbing. And the cost can also correlate to the pricing for labor to actually maintain the piping. And we also have that yearly maintenance. So I believe JMO has a perfect explanation as to why this maintenance correlates with the causation for why it lasts so long and why cast iron pipes. So let me just actually elaborate before he begins. So there are two types of piping that I've used. There's cast iron piping and ductile iron piping. And for our purposes, we mentioned ductile iron piping, which is the new type of piping that's used. When we compare it to cast iron piping in cities such as Toronto, which are 60 to 100 years old, the cast iron piping, these pipes are more likely to omit iron into the water, and they're more likely to show and be picked up by the Xrf machines. That has reason for improvement, that has reason for maintenance, and that's also why we need to pay attention to both the economic implications and connecting that in with the health. So if anyone else wants to jump right in.
Yeah, I can jump in to kind of summarize that. Basically, the piping that's used has a lot of iron, right? And what happens is as it's not maintained, the iron starts to corrode away, and that comes into the water drinking quality. And if you consume that iron, it can be deadly. And so it's up to the government to maintain these water mains and ensure that the iron doesn't get into the water as well. So they actually spend millions of dollars each year replacing all of the water mains that are there. So it does take a long process, and they're not able to complete all of them each year. So I assume that at least like once or twice in a decade, they update these water mains and they add different types of materials in. And that's why iron would play a big role in economic implications.
Okay, we had a couple questions come through the chat, so I'll read you the first one. So based on your results, are you interested in any political advocacy such as taking your research to your city councillor to advocate for changes?
I can jump in there. I think that a lot of our research was qualitative data, so we can't completely determine what the issue may be, but that is something that we would like to look further into and maybe do some math on and find some quantitative data that we could relate to the government standards. And if there are some issues, then we could bring it up to the politics and some political issues if need be.
So I just want to add something in. So we are living in great times. COVID is around us, and no, it's terrible. But with COVID restrictions, if they were to be alleviated, what our next plans would be to actually go to these treatment plants and to really see what's going on with, you know, iron, zinc, copper. Like, if there's something that's going on that we don't know from the information that was presented and the information that we researched in the year and a half. So I think that is our next steps before we can have any intervention from political figures who can take this to the next step.
I would also add that a potential way that we would talk to like the political side of things is in reference to the article that we mentioned at the beginning. So when we were doing our research, we found a lot about how the water is being treated well, and also some ways it could be treated better. So we believe a way to notify people when water is being dumped into the lake so that they don't go swimming or don't go fishing on those times would be a way to improve the health of the people during those times.
That question came from Jaspreet. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. I see that you have your hand up. Did you have a follow-up question to ask?
She's driving right now, so no, it's probably up by mistake.
Okay, well, yes, safety is top priority at c.l.s. and everywhere else, so good. So we had another question in the chat. Nice presentation. I didn't see anything about pH or anion concentrations of the water. Did you consider these in your analysis of the differences in dissolved metals?
Yeah, I can jump right in for that one. So initially that was the plan. That was the plan for us to, you know, take the water, look at the concentrations, and compare it to Ontario standards. But once we got to beam time, we realized that finding proper or like solid concentrations and finding solid numbers would be really difficult and would require some exhaustive mathematics, such as, you know, linear combination analysis and linear fitting, which, like in David's words, is a master's degree on its own. So instead, we decided to take a qualitative approach. And since we needed some kind of comparison, we just looked at the peak intensities and compared that data. So that definitely is something we can look further into, and another further research avenue for the people who actually do have the time and the, you know, the proper guidance to be able to do linear combinational fitting.
Might I add, our entire story has different aspects that we weren't able to present in the seminar, but part of our research, since we presented Xrf data, we also had another scan, which was veins. So the vein scan was looking at the speciation of different metals. And what we tried to target was iron. So there was ferrous chloride versus ferric chloride, right? What is that difference? And that connects back to the idea of pH and anion. We could have researched the pH levels and how ferrous chloride versus ferric versus iron hydroxide versus ferrous chloride, show different results, and that would lead us to a different avenue of research that wasn't connected to our hypothesis. But I think that is definitely something that we can consider if we want to connect this afterwards.
To add on to what Aryan was mentioning earlier, we did spend some time explaining how our hypothesis and research question changed. And so he mentioned we couldn't compare it to Ontario standards, but what we could do, as he mentioned with the peaks, is compare them relative to each other. And that was the best way possible that we could make use of the data that we did find and the time that we did spend, is make sure that, okay, we understand how these interact amongst each other, maybe not to an existing standard, but it still gave us an interesting avenue, I think, to go down.
Does anyone else have any questions? I see Tracy has her hand up. Literally has her hand up. Go for it, Tracy.
So nice presentation, guys. That was very well done. I particularly like the connections that you made between the deep science research analysis that you were doing and bringing that back to society and you know, civil connections and decisions and why this is important. That's really, really good. I'd like to further down that path a little bit, if I might, and ask how you have been affected as citizens, as students, and your learning. You're all still in high school at this point. Presumably, you have at least some education in front of you, and then a career after that. What of this experience will you take with you? And I'm going
I can start.
to answer, please. Sorry, each of you answer.
I can start on this one. So something that was really interesting to me is going back to the article from the beginning. I think it's like challenging the status quo. So you can't always expect that the greater powers that be, like the government, has your back on everything and is telling you everything that's going on as much as they should be. So it's really interesting, I think, for us to get to take like a peek behind the curtain a little bit of what kind of data they might be dealing with. We kind of got something similar and got to draw our own conclusions from it without their bias. And so it's interesting to me, like going forward, is how can I continue to take a peek behind the curtain and question the things that are being presented to me online in case studies, a lot of the things that we use for our analysis too, for why does this matter to people? How come there's zinc in the water? Even that, a lot of the things we read, some of the things were pretty ridiculous. So we had to question them, like, is this actually true? Did someone actually go and dump zinc into our lake, or is that false? So I think generally just like being critical of the things you're consuming and being a mindful consumer of media.
Yeah, to add on to this point. Oh, okay. Do you want to go?
No, go for it.
Okay, to add on to Ronnie's point, like the main article we found about the bypass wasn't actually from like a news article, like from CP24 or like the Canadian government. It was actually like from this blog from the quote we mentioned, the man Mark Matson, who runs like the water main thing, and he was the one who kind of did like the expose on his website, like, hey, this happened and this wasn't really talked about, and then like the website, they started keeping like a water log for each bypass, which is pretty interesting. And should I
so
answer?
I'm just gonna.
I'll go after Aryan and like answer it all myself after that.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna pick up from Chloe there, and I'm gonna be completely frank. Like, this research product made me just like, it reinforced the fact that there's like a lot more learning to be done outside the books. You know, asking question no one's asking, and trying to solve a problem no one knew existed. So like this question, when trying to do research for it, was really difficult to find exact or really relative research studies, right? So there was a lot of critical thinking required, where it's, you know, okay, so this research study says this says this, you got to connect it to make sure your presentation flows well, right? You got to use different types of sources to actually make sure, you know, everything is in sync with everything and everything checks out, right? And I feel like that critical thinking and that kind of, you know, stimulus you get is like unbeatable. It felt really good, to be completely honest.
Yeah, like the collaboration part was actually very big, and like I think I learned a lot, like especially from the grade 12s. I didn't even know like the website we used to organize our notes was called Notion, and I thought it was so cool. I didn't know this existed. I always use like Google Docs, and I was like, this isn't very effective. So I think like things like that and like learning new things from each other, that was very important, and I feel like I can take that forward for next year.
Yeah, I'll jump right in. So the research that we've done, it really shifted my perspective, right? I think I was always a hypocrite in a way, because I've always really had one, you know, tunnel vision, you could say. And when you're with research, mistakes are common. I think David even mentioned this, that mistakes are there, and they're not really mistakes. They're just about reflection and growth. And as someone who wants to do research, you know, as their means of living, biotech research, to really, you know, have an impact in biology and healthcare, I think the actual research may or may not have an impact, but the process, the story, the experience, I think that is what's going to shift. That really shifted my mindset, and I didn't know exactly how you have to work with others, the collaboration, how that story matters more than just the research, how that ties in with your knowledge. So I think that's just my 2 cents, and I think that is really something that I look forward to experiencing again in the future.
Yeah, like from my behalf, I really totally agree with everything everyone said so far. But I think something that really inspired me about this research was to ask questions when we go like outside. We will walk by the beach or the lake. We never really question the things that are out there. We would never. Personally, I would never question if there's something in the water or if the government hasn't been taking the precautions that they should be. But after exploring and like doing all this research, reading all this literature, especially the Ashbridge article that everyone's been talking about. I learned to question things and not trust that everything that's out there. And personally, I would have never guessed that the government would be not sharing these things. And yeah, just made me question everything that's around us and helped me develop my critical thinking as well as my collaboration. It was great working with everyone here.
Okay, so yeah, I would also similar to what everyone else was saying. Typically in school, we did do experiments, we did do like lab and things like that, but they were never to this level. And I think one of the reasons for that was there was always a set result, right? The teacher or everyone knew in some way what was going to happen at the end, but we didn't have that knowledge throughout our research. And one of the things that this did was that we actually had to make the product ourselves. We had to ask our own questions. We had to make our own hypothesis and do everything entirely on our own. And so that taught me a lot about actually making experiments and trying things for the first time, and also being wrong and having to change what you think in the middle of your research. I found that was like for me, it was pretty sad because when we didn't find like many of the elements that we were looking for on the data time, we had to like rethink our story and rethink what was really there. And that's something that you would never really get in school because you know what's going to happen. And yeah, so I think that was a big part of my learning.
And I guess to wrap it up, kind of building off of Lovin and everyone's points, really, I think my biggest weakness, and especially because of like the way that schools are so standardized, is, I always try to focus on like finishing and completing everything in a way that everything's like set in stone. Like there's it's just fact. But the thing I noticed from doing this type of project that is like in the real world, it's not one of those that you do at school, is that there's times that you won't have the answers by the time. There's times that you may be wrong. There's times that you will have to look further, right? There were many times that we were like, oh, we want to find definitive answers from the data that we got, right? But we can't do that. We have to assume at some point, right? We have to keep asking those questions, like Rohani said, like peeking behind the curtain. So I think the biggest takeaway that I had from this experience was like, always making the effort despite of the results. I think just always asking those questions, always putting forth your best effort into doing whatever you do, without worrying too much about what the end result is. I think that was my biggest takeaway from this.
If I might add very quickly, I think the biggest thing this was 16 months of work, right, with the same 7 people. So obviously I feel like I know everyone here really well, but the biggest learning is after 16 months, you learn more about what you don't know than what you do know. So it's kind of like your circle of competency, like you really realize all your unknown unknowns. So yes, I know a lot about plumbing now, but there's much about, elements and chemistry that I still don't totally understand and that I wish I could and could have included in the seminar. And I'm sure everyone echoes that sentiment as well.
Those are really insightful answers. Thank you so much for reflecting on that and sharing your thoughts with me. I'd like to extend it also to the teachers and put them on the spot. As teachers working in a process like this with students, do you have some takeaways that you might bring into your teaching practice?
I'll go first, Mr. Rabadia, since camera's not even on. Oh, and he's got like a little triangle at the top, like he's gonna like not get connection. Okay. Yeah, I mean, like Rohani said, like we've been doing this for like a really long time now. It was supposed to be in September, but things changed as everything did this year. And we've been working together really closely, and that doesn't happen very much with students, to see that process with them that closely, because you usually have like a large class. Everyone's doing the same lab. Everyone's getting the same expected results. I would love to take this and like incorporate it somehow into regular practices. It would take some thinking of how that would work, but that idea of them researching something that interests them, and applying it to the curriculum is something that I look forward to thinking about. And while I have the floor with all the participants here, I just want to say how proud I am of all of you. This was so good, like beyond anything I could have expected to come out of this.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm sorry, not sorry for putting you on the spot, but thank you for sharing your thoughts. And
It looks like Mr. Rabadia's internet. He's got like a triangle in the top right corner left. I don't know if he's connected properly right now.
I see that. I might have to chase him down and pick on him later, maybe.
Okay, I'll maybe just kind of jump in. We did have one final question, and I wonder if students, if you could just answer it briefly as we are wrapping this up. But congratulations, everyone. I really enjoyed your presentation. My question is, with all of your research, how do you personally feel about consuming the tap water in Peel now?
Can I go first? All right. Okay. So for me, it's not about like consuming the tap water. It's actually about like bathing and showering in the tap water. And I didn't know that that was like a thing until Jaymo mentioned it, like when we were actually doing the research, was like hair loss is actually something that could happen due to these elements being the thing. And that's one of the things that we looked at. And that was crazy because like I remember like doing like my homework and stuff after we meet and just like seeing like random strands of hair and just being like, oh my God, I'm gonna go bald. And yeah, that was the big thing for me.
I can jump off right off that because that's like the biggest thing that connected with me is like I've been noticing this and a lot of people I'm pretty sure have. I need to get a water softener like Pedro mentioned because after seeing like the results, maybe there's heavy metals present and that's probably why my hair is going bad or my skin's going bad. But I think that's the biggest thing that hit me.
Just going to quickly add, what I think it's actually a good thing that we didn't pick up anything. We're working with a small sample. We're using one technique. Maybe with a different technique, we may have had different results. But I think it's a good sign, obviously, right? There's no arsenic, right? There's no chromium. We have iron, which is something that is not hazardous. We have zinc, copper. So I think with the result that we have, it's a good sign moving forward.
I think that's a good point to end on. So just again, thank you everyone for taking your time to join us in the seminar today. It was an excellent presentation, and yeah, with that, I'll call this to a close and stop the live streaming. So thank you once again, everybody, for joining in.